Hi guys, so today I wanted to read more of Brave New World, and I don't know if this is legal, but I really like this book, so I'm gonna read it, some of it, and hopefully I don't get in trouble for it. Okay, so let's go. The room into which the three were ushered was the controller's study. His lordship will be down in a moment. The Gamma butler left them to themselves. Helmholtz laughed aloud. "It's more like a caffeine solution party than a trial," he said, and let himself fall into the most luxurious of the pneumatic armchairs. "Cheer up, Bernard," he added, catching sight of his friend's green, unhappy face. But Bernard would not be cheered. Without answering, without even looking at Helmholtz, he went and sat down on the most uncomfortable chair in the room, carefully chosen in the obscure hope of somehow depreciating the wrath of the higher powers. The savage, meanwhile, wandered restlessly round the room, peering with vague, superficial inquisitiveness at the books in the shelves, at the soundtrack rolls, and reading machine bobbins in their numbered pigeonholes. On the table under the window lay a massive volume, bound in limp black leather surrogate, stamped with large gold T's. He picked it up and opened it. My Life and Work, by R. Ford. The book had been published at Detroit by the Society for the Propagation of Fortean Knowledge. Idly he turned the pages, read a sentence here, a paragraph there, and had just come to the conclusion that the book didn't interest him when the door opened and the resident world controller for Western Europe walked briskly into the room. Mustafa Mond shook hands with all three of them, but it was to the Savage that he addressed himself. "So you don't much like civilization, Mr. Savage," he said. The Savage looked at him. He had been prepared to lie, to bluster, to remain sullenly unresponsive, but, reassured by the good-humored intelligence of the controller's face, he decided to tell the truth, straightforwardly. "No." He shook his head. Bernard started and looked horrified. What would the controller think? To be labeled as the friend of a man who said that he didn't like civilization, said it openly, and, of all people, to the controller, it was terrible. "But John," he began. A look from Mustafa Mond reduced him to an abject silence. Of course, the Savage went on to admit, "There are some very nice things, all that music in the air, for instance. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about my ears, and sometimes voices." The Savage's face lit up with a sudden pleasure. "Have you read it too?" he asked. "I thought nobody knew about that book here in England." "Almost nobody. I'm one of the very few. It's prohibited, you see. But as I make the laws here, I can also break them. With impunity, Mr. Marx," he added, turning to Bernard, "which I'm afraid you can't do." Bernard sank into a yet more hopeless misery. "But why is it prohibited?" asked the Savage. In the excitement of meeting a man who had read Shakespeare, he had momentarily forgotten everything else. The controller shrugged his shoulders. "Because it's old, that's the chief reason. We haven't any use for old things here." "Even when they're beautiful?" "Particularly when they're beautiful. Beauty's attractive, and we don't want people to be attracted to old things. We want them to like the new ones." "But the new ones are so stupid and horrible. Those plays where there's nothing but helicopters flying about and you feel the people kissing." He made a grimace. "Goats and monkeys." Only in Othello's words could he find an adequate vehicle for his contempt and hatred. Nice tame animals, anyhow," the controller murmured parenthetically. "Why don't you let them see Othello instead?" "I've told you, it's old. Besides, they couldn't understand it." Yes, that was true. He remembered how Helmholtz had laughed at Romeo and Juliet. "Well then," he said, after a pause, "something new that's like Othello, and that they could understand." "Well, that's what we've all been wanting to write," said Helmholtz, breaking a long silence. "And it's what you never will write," said the controller. "Besides, if it were really like Othello, nobody could understand it, however new it might be. And if it were new, it couldn't possibly be like Othello." "Why not?" "Yes, why not?" Helmholtz repeated. He, too, was forgetting the unpleasant realities of the situation. Green with anxiety and apprehension, only Bernard remembered them. The others ignored him. Why not? Because our world is not the same as Othello's world. You can't make flivvers without steel, and you can't make tragedies without social instability. The world's stable now. People are happy. They get what they want, and they never want what they can't get. They're well off, they're safe, they're never ill, they're not afraid of death, they're blissfully ignorant of passion and old age, they're plagued with no mothers or fathers, they've got no wives or children or lovers to feel strongly about. They're so conditioned that they practically can't help behaving as they ought to behave. And if anything should go wrong, there's Selma, which you go and chuck out of the window in the name of liberty, Mr. Savage. Liberty. He laughed, expecting Deltas to know what liberty is, and now expecting them to understand Othello, my good boy. The Savage was silent for a little. All the same, he insisted, obstinately, Othello's good. Othello's better than all those feelies. Of course it is, the controller agreed, but that's the price we have to pay for stability. You got to choose between happiness and what people used to call high art. We've sacrificed the high art. We have the feelies and the scent organ instead. But they don't mean anything. They mean themselves. They mean a lot of agreeable sensations to the audience. But they're told by an idiot. The controller laughed. You're not being very polite to your friend, Mr. Watson, one of our most distinguished emotional engineers. But he's right, said Helmholtz gloomily, because it is idiotic, writing when there's nothing to say. Precisely, but that requires the most enormous ingenuity. You're making flivvers out of the absolute minimum of steel, works of art out of practically nothing but pure sensation. The Savage shook his head. It all seems quite horrible. It all seems to me quite horrible. Of course it does. Actual happiness always looks pretty squalid in comparison with the overcompensations for misery. And, of course, stability isn't nearly so spectacular as instability. And being contented has none of the glamour of a good fight against misfortune, none of the picturesqueness of a struggle with temptation, or a fatal overthrow by passion or doubt. Happiness is never grand. I suppose not, said the Savage, after a silence. But need it be quite so bad as those twins? He passed his hand over his eyes, as though he were trying to wipe away the remembered image of those long rows of identical midgets at the assembling tables, those queued-up twin herds at the entrance to the Bentford monorail station, those human maggots swarming round Linda's bed of death, the endlessly repeated face of his assailants. He looked at his bandaged left hand and shuddered. Horrible. But how useful. I see you don't like our Bakhanovsky groups, but I assure you, they're the foundation on which everything else is built. They're the gyroscope that stabilizes the rocket plane of state on its unswerving course. The deep voice thrillingly vibrated. The gesticulating hand implied all space and the onrush of the irresistible machine. Mustafa Man's oratory was almost up to synthetic standards. I was wondering, said the Savage, why you had them at all. Seeing that you can get whatever you want out of those bottles, why don't you make everybody an Alpha Double Plus while you're at it? Mustafa Mann laughed. Because we have no wish to have our throats cut, he answered. We believe in happiness and stability. A society of alphas couldn't fail to be unstable and miserable. Imagine a factory staffed by alphas, that is to say, by separate and unrelated individuals of good heredity and conditioned so as to be capable, within limits, of making a free choice and assuming responsibilities. Imagine it, he repeated. The Savage tried to imagine it, not very successfully. It's an absurdity. An alpha-decanted, alpha-conditioned man would go mad if he had to do epsilon semi-moron work, go mad or start smashing things up. Alphas can be completely socialized, but only on condition that you make them do alpha work. Only an epsilon can be expected to make epsilon sacrifices, for the good reason that for him, they aren't sacrifices. They're the line of least resistance. His conditioning has laid down rails along which he's got to run. He can't help himself, he's foredoomed. Even after decanting, he's still inside a bottle, an invisible bottle of infantile and embryonic fixations. Each one of us, of course, the controller meditatively continued, goes through life inside a bottle. But if we happen to be alphas, our bottles are, relatively speaking, enormous. We should suffer acutely if we were confined in a narrower space. You cannot pour upper caste champagne surrogate into lower caste bottles. It's obvious theoretically, but it has also been proven in actual practice. The result of the Cyprus experiment was convincing. What was that? Asked the savage. Mustafa Mon smiled. Well, you can call it an experiment in rebottling if you like. It began in AF 473. The controllers had the island of Cyprus cleared of all its existing inhabitants and recolonized with a specially prepared batch of 22,000 alphas. All agricultural and industrial equipment was handed over to them, and they were left to manage their own affairs. The result exactly fulfilled all the theoretical predictions. The land wasn't properly worked, there were strikes in all the factories, the laws were set at naught, orders disobeyed, all the people detailed for a spell of low-grade work were perpetually intriguing for high-grade jobs, and all the people with high-grade jobs were counter-intriguing at all costs to stay where they were. Within 6 years, they were having a first-class civil war, when 19 out of the 22,000 had been killed. The survivors unanimously petitioned the world controllers to resume the government of the island, which they did, and that was the end of the only society of alphas that the world has ever seen. The savage sighed profoundly. The optimum population, said Mustafa Mond, is modeled on the iceberg. 8/9 below the waterline, 1/9 above. And they're happy below the waterline? Happier than above it. Happier than your friend here, for example. He pointed. In spite of that awful work? Awful? They don't find it so. On the contrary, they like it. It's light, it's childishly simple. No strain on the mind or the muscles. 7.5 hours of mild, unexhausting labor, and then the soma ration and games and unrestricted copulation and the feelies. What more can they ask for? True, he added, they might ask for shorter hours, and of course we could give them shorter hours. Technically, it would be perfectly simple to reduce all lower caste working hours to 3 or 4 hours a day. But would they be any happier for that? No, they wouldn't. The experiment was tried more than a century and a half ago. The whole of Ireland was put on to the 4-hour day. What was the result? Unrest and a large increase in the consumption of soma, that was all. Those 3.5 hours of extra leisure were so far from being a source of happiness that people felt constrained to take a holiday from them. The Inventions Office is stuffed with plans for labor-saving processes, thousands of them. Mustafa Mond made a lavish gesture. And why don't we put them into execution? For the sake of the laborers, it would be sheer cruelty to afflict them with excessive leisure. It's the same with agriculture. We could synthesize every morsel of food if we wanted to, but we don't. We prefer to keep 1/3 of the population on the land, for their own sakes, because it takes longer to get food out of the land than out of a factory. Besides, we have stability to think of. We don't want to change. Every change is a menace to stability. That's another reason why we're so chary of applying new inventions. Every discovery in pure science is potentially subversive. Even science must sometimes be treated as a possible enemy. Yes, even science. Science? The savage frowned. He knew the word, but what it exactly signified he could not say. Shakespeare and the old men of the Pueblo had never mentioned science, and from Linda he had only gathered the vaguest hints. Science was something you made helicopters with, something that caused you to laugh at the corn dances, something that prevented you from being wrinkled and losing your teeth. He made a desperate effort to take the controller's meaning. Yes, Mustafa Mond was saying, that's another item in the cost of stability. It isn't only art that's incompatible with happiness, it's also science. Science is dangerous. We have to keep it most carefully chained and muzzled. What? Said Helmholtz, in astonishment. But we're always saying that science is everything. It's a hypnopetic platitude. 3 times a week between 13 and 17, put in Bernard. And all the science propaganda we do at the college. Yes, but what sort of science? Asked Mustafa Mon sarcastically. You've had no scientific training, so you can't judge. I was a pretty good physicist in my time. Too good. Good enough to realize that all our science is just a cookery book, with an orthodox theory of cooking that nobody's allowed to question, and a list of recipes that mustn't be added to except by special permission from the head cook. I'm the head cook now. But I was an inquisitive young scullion once. I started doing a bit of cooking on my own. Unorthodox cooking, illicit cooking. A bit of real science, in fact. He was silent. What happened? Asked Helmholtz Watson. The controller sighed. Very nearly what's going to happen to you young men. I was on the point of being sent to an island. The words galvanized Bernard into violent and unseemly activity. Send me to an island? He jumped up, ran across the room, and stood gesticulating in the front of the controller. You can't send me. I haven't done anything. It was the others. I swear it was the others. He pointed accusingly to Helmholtz and the savage. Oh, please don't send me to an island. I'll promise I do what I ought. Give me another chance. Please give me another chance. The tears began to flow. I tell you, it's their fault, he sobbed. And not to Iceland. Oh, please, your lordship, please. And in a paroxysm of abjection, he threw himself on his knees before the controller. Mustafa Mon tried to make him get up, but Bernard persisted in his groveling. The stream of words poured out inexhaustibly. In the end, the controller had to ring for his fourth secretary. Bring 3 men, he ordered, and take Mr. Marks into a bedroom. Give him a good soma vaporization, and then put him to bed and leave him. The fourth secretary went out and returned with 3 green-uniformed twin footmen. Still shouting and sobbing, Bernard was carried out. One would think he was going to have his throat cut, said the controller, as the door closed. Whereas, if he had the smallest sense, he'd understand that his punishment is really a reward. He's being sent to an island. That's to say, he's being sent to a place where he'll meet the most interesting set of men and women to be found anywhere in the world. All the people who, for one reason or another, have got too self-consciously individual to fit into community life. All the people who aren't satisfied with orthodoxy, who've got independent ideas of their own. Everyone, in a word, who's anyone. I almost envy you, Mr. Watson. Helmholtz laughed. Then why aren't you on an island yourself? Because, finally, I preferred this, the controller answered. I was given the choice, to be sent to an island where I could have got on with my pure science, or to be taken on to the Controllers' Council with the prospect of succeeding in due course to an actual controllership. I chose this and let the science go. After a little silence. Sometimes, he added, I rather regret the science. Happiness is a hard master, particularly other people's happiness. A much harder master if one isn't conditioned to accept it unquestioningly than truth. He sighed, fell silent again, then continued in a brisker tone. Well, duty's duty. One can't consult one's own preference. I'm interested in truth. I like science. But truth's a menace, science is a public danger. As dangerous as it's been beneficent. It has given us the stablest equilibrium in history. China's was hopelessly insecure by comparison. Even the primitive matriarchies weren't steadier than we are. Thanks, I repeat, to science. But we can't allow science to undo its own good work. That's why we so carefully limit the scope of its researches. That's why I almost got sent to an island. We don't allow it to deal with any but the most immediate problems of the moment. All other enquiries are most sedulously discouraged. It's curious, he went on, after a little pause, to read what people in the time of our Ford used to write about scientific progress. They seem to have imagined that it could be allowed to go on indefinitely, regardless of everything else. Knowledge was the highest good, truth the supreme value. All the rest was secondary and subordinate. True, ideas were beginning to change even then. Our Ford himself did a great deal to shift the emphasis from truth and beauty to comfort and happiness. Mass production demanded the shift. Universal happiness keeps the wheels steadily turning. Truth and beauty can't. And, of course, Whenever the masses seized political power, then it was happiness rather than truth and beauty that mattered. Still, in spite of everything, unrestricted scientific research was still permitted. People still went on talking about truth and beauty as though they were the sovereign goods, right up to the time of the 9 Years' War. That made them change their tune, all right. What's the point of truth or beauty or knowledge when the anthrax bombs are popping all around you? That was when science first began to be controlled, after the 9 Years' War. People were ready to have even their appetites controlled then, anything for a quiet life. We've gone on controlling ever since. It hasn't been very good for truth, of course, but it's been very good for happiness. One can't have something for nothing. Happiness has got to be paid for. You're paying for it, Mr. Watson, paying because you happen to be too much interested in beauty. I was too much interested in truth. I paid too. But you didn't go to an island, said the savage, breaking a long silence. The controller smiled. That's how I paid, by choosing to serve happiness. Other people's, not mine. It's lucky, he added, after a pause, that there are such a lot of islands in the world. I don't know what we should do without them. Put you all in the lethal chamber, I suppose. By the way, Mr. Watson, would you like a tropical climate? The Marquesas, for example, or Samoa, or something rather more bracing? Helmholtz rose from his pneumatic chair. I should like a thoroughly bad climate, he answered. I believe one would write better if the climate were bad. If there were a lot of wind and storms, for example. The controller nodded his approbation. I like your spirit, Mr. Watson. I like it very much indeed. As much as I officially disapprove of it. He smiled. What about the Falkland Islands? Yes, I think that will do, Helmholtz answered. And now, if you don't mind, I'll go and see how poor Bernard's getting on. Art, science, you seem to have paid a fairly high price for your happiness, said the savage, when they were alone. Anything else? Well, religion, of course, replied the controller. There used to be something called God before the 9 Years' War. But I was forgetting, you know all about God, I suppose. Well, the savage hesitated. He would have liked to say something about solitude, about night, about the massa lying pale under the moon, about the precipice, the plunge into shadowy darkness, about death. He would have liked to speak, but there were no words, not even in Shakespeare. The controller, meanwhile, had crossed to the other side of the room and was unlocking a large safe set into the wall between the bookshelves. The heavy door swung open, rummaging in the darkness within. It's a subject, he said, that has always had a great interest for me. He pulled out a thick black volume. You've never read this, for example. The savage took it. The Holy Bible, containing the Old and New Testaments, he read aloud from the title page. Nor this. It was a small book and had lost its cover. The Imitation of Christ. Nor this. He handed out another volume. The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. And I've got plenty more, Mustapha Mann continued, resuming his seat. A whole collection of pornographic old books. God in the safe and forward on the shelves. He pointed with a laugh to his avowed library, to the shelves of books, the rack full of reading machine bobbins and soundtrack rolls. But if you know about God, why don't you tell them? Asked the savage indignantly. Why don't you give them these books about God? For the same reason as we don't give them Othello. They're old. They're about God hundreds of years ago. Not about God now. But God doesn't change. Men do, though. What difference does that make? All the difference in the world, said Mustapha Mann. He got up again and walked to the safe. There was a man called Cardinal Newman, he said. A cardinal, he exclaimed parenthetically, was a kind of arch community songster. I, Pandulph of fair Milan, cardinal. I've read about them in Shakespeare. Of course you have. Well, as I was saying, there was a man called Cardinal Newman. Ah, here's the book. He put it up. And while I'm about it, I'll take this one too. It's by a man called Maine de Biran. He was a philosopher, if you know what that was. A man who dreams of fewer things than there are in heaven and earth, said the savage promptly. Quite so. I'll read you one of the things he did dream of in a moment. Meanwhile, listen to what this old arch community songster said. He opened the book at the place marked by a slip of paper and began to read. We are not our own any more than what we possess is our own. We did not make ourselves, we cannot be supreme over ourselves. We are not our own masters, we are God's property. Is it not our happiness thus to view the matter? Is it any happiness or any comfort to consider that we are our own? It may be thought so by the young and prosperous. These may think it a great thing to have everything, as they suppose, their own way, to depend on no one, to have to think of nothing out of sight, to be without the irksomeness of continual acknowledgment, continual prayer, continual reference of what they do to the will of another. But as time goes on, they, as all men, will find that independence was not made for man, will find that that it is an unnatural state, will do for a while, but will not carry on safely to the end. Mustafa Aman paused, put down the first book, and, picking up the other, turned over the pages. "Take this, for example," he said, and in his deep voice once more began to read. "A man grows old. He feels in himself that radical sense of weakness, of listlessness, of discomfort, which accompanies the advance of age, and, feeling thus, imagines himself merely sick, lulling his fears with the notion that this distressing condition is due to some particular cause, from which, as an illness, he hopes to recover. Vain imaginings that sickness is old age, and a horrible disease it is. They say that it is the fear of death and of what comes after death that makes men turn to religion as they advance in years. But my own experience has given me the conviction that, quite apart from any such terrors or imaginings, the religious sentiment tends to develop as we grow older, to develop because, as the passions grow calm, as the fancy and sensibilities are less excited and less excitable, our reason becomes less troubled in its working, less obscured by the images, desires, and distractions in which it used to be absorbed, whereupon God emerges as from behind a cloud. Our soul feels, sees, turns towards the source of all light, turns naturally and inevitably. For now that all that gave to the world of sensations its life and charms has begun to leak away from us, now that phenomenal existence is no more bolstered up by impressions from within or from without, we feel the need to lean on something that abides, something that will never play us false, a reality, an absolute and everlasting truth. Yes, we inevitably turn to God, for this religious sentiment is of its nature so pure, so delightful that the soul experiences it, that it makes up to us for all our other losses." Mustafa Aman shut the book and leaned back in his chair. One of the numerous things in heaven and earth that these philosophers didn't dream about was this. He waved his hand. Us, the modern world. You can only be independent of God while you've got youth and prosperity. Independence won't take you safely to the end. Well, we've now got youth and prosperity right to the end. What follows? Evidently that we can be independent of God. The religious sentiment will compensate us for all our losses. But there aren't any losses for us to compensate. Religious sentiment is superfluous. And why should we go hunting for a substitute for youthful desires when youthful desires never fail? A substitute for distractions when we go on enjoying all the old fooleries to the very last? What need have we of repose when our minds and bodies continue to delight in activity? Of consolation when we have soma? Of something immovable when there is the social order? Then you think there is no God? No, I think there quite probably is one. Then why— Mustafa Aman checked him. But he manifests himself in different ways to different men. In pre-modern times, he manifested himself as the being that's described in these books. Now, how does he manifest himself now? Asked the savage. Well, he manifests himself as an absence, as though he weren't there at all. That's your fault. Call it the fault of civilization. God isn't compatible with machinery and scientific medicine and universal happiness. You must make your choice. Our civilization has chosen machinery and medicine and happiness. That's why I have to keep these books locked up in the safe. They're smut. People would be shocked if... The savage interrupted him. But isn't it natural to feel there's a God? You might as well ask if it's natural to do up one's trousers with zippers, said the controller sarcastically. You remind me of another of those old fellows called Bradley. He defined philosophy as the finding of bad reason for what one believes by instinct. As if one believed anything by instinct. One believes things because one has been conditioned to believe them. Finding bad reasons for what one believes for other bad reasons, that's philosophy. People believe in God because they've been conditioned to believe in God. But all the same, insisted the savage, it is natural to believe in God when you're alone, quite alone, in the night, thinking about death. But people are never alone now, said Mustafa Mond. We make them hate solitude, and we arrange their lives so that it's almost impossible for them ever to have it. The savage nodded gloomily. At Malpais, he had suffered because they had shut him out from the communal activities of the pueblo. In civilized London, he was suffering because he could never escape from those communal activities, never be quietly alone. Do you remember that bit in King Lear, said the savage at last. The gods are just, and of our pleasant vices make instruments to plague us. The dark and vicious place where thee he got cost him his eyes. And Edmund answers, You remember, he's wounded, he's dying. Thou hast spoken right, 'tis true. The wheel has come full circle, I am here. What about that? Doesn't there seem to be a God managing, punishing, rewarding? Well, does there? Questioned the controller in his turn. You can indulge in any number of pleasant vices with a free martin and run no risk of having your eyes put out by your son's mistress. The wheel has come full circle, I am here. But where would Edmund be nowadays? Sitting in a pneumatic chair with his arm round a girl's waist, sucking away at his sex hormone chewing gum and looking at the feelies. The gods are just, no doubt, but their code of law is dictated, in the last resort, by the people who organize society. Providence takes its cue from men. Are you sure? Asked the savage. Are you quite sure that the Edmund in the pneumatic chair hasn't been just as heavily punished as the Edmund who's wounded and bleeding to death? The gods are just. Haven't they used his pleasant vices as an instrument to degrade him? Degrade him from what position? As a happy, hard-working, goods-consuming citizen, he's perfect. Of course, if you choose some other standard than ours, then perhaps you might say he was degraded. But you've got to stick to one set of postulates. You can't play electromagnetic golf according to the rules of centrifugal bumblepuppy. But value dwells not in particular will, said the savage. It holds his estimate and dignity as well wherein 'tis precious of itself as in the prizer. Come, come, protested Mustafa Mond. That's going rather far, isn't it? If you allowed yourselves to think of God, you wouldn't allow yourselves to be degraded by pleasant vices. You'd have a reason for bearing things patiently, for doing things with courage. I've seen it with the Indians. I'm sure you have, said Mustafa Mond. But then we aren't Indians. There isn't any need for a civilized man to bear anything that's seriously unpleasant. As for doing things, Lord forbid that he should get the idea into his head. It would upset the whole social order if men started doing things on their own. What about self-denial, then? If you had a God, you'd have a reason for self-denial. But industrial civilization is only possible when there's no self-denial. Self-indulgence up to the very limits imposed by hygiene and economics. Otherwise the wheels stop turning. You'd have a reason for chastity, said the savage, blushing a little as he spoke the words. But chastity means passion. Chastity means neurasthenia. And passion and neurasthenia mean instability. And instability means the end of civilization. You can't have a lasting civilization without plenty of pleasant vices. But God's the reason for everything noble and fine and heroic. If you had a God... My dear young friend, said Mustafa Mond, civilization has absolutely no need for nobility or heroism. These things are symptoms of political inefficiency. In a properly organized society like ours, nobody has any opportunities for being noble or heroic. Conditions have got to be thoroughly unstable before the occasion can arise. where there are wars, where there are divided allegiances, where there are temptations to be resisted, objects of love to be fought for or defended. There, obviously, nobility and heroism have some sense. But there aren't any wars nowadays. The greatest care is taken to prevent you from loving anyone too much. There's no such thing as a divided allegiance. You're so conditioned that you can't help doing what you ought to do. And what you ought to do is on the whole so pleasant, so many of the natural impulses are allowed free play, that there really aren't any temptations to resist. And if ever, by some unlucky chance, anything unpleasant should somehow happen, why, there's always Soma to give you a holiday from the facts. And there's always Soma to calm your anger, to reconcile you to your enemies, to make you patient and long-suffering. In the past, you could only accomplish these things by making a great effort and after years of hard moral training. Now you swallow 2 or 3 half-gram tablets, and there you are. Anybody can be virtuous now. You can carry at least half your mortality about in a bottle. Christianity without tears, that's what Soma is. But the tears are necessary. Don't you remember what Othello said? If after every tempest came such calms, may the winds blow till they have wakened death. There's a story about one of the old Indians used to tell us, about the girl of Mataski. The young men who wanted to marry her had to do a morning's hoeing in her garden. It seemed easy, but there were flies and mosquitoes, magic ones. Most of the young men simply couldn't stand the biting and stinging, but the one that could, he got the girl. Charming! But in civilized countries, said the controller, you can have girls without hoeing for them, and there aren't any flies or mosquitoes to sting you. We got rid of them all centuries ago. The savage nodded, frowning. You got rid of them. Yes, that's just like you, getting rid of everything unpleasant instead of learning to put up with it. Whether 'tis better in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. But you don't do either. Neither suffer nor oppose, you just abolish the slings and arrows. It's too easy. He was suddenly silent, thinking of his mother. In her room on the 27th floor, Linda had floated into a sea of singing lights and perfumed caress, floated away out of space, out of time, out of the prison of her memories, her habits, her aged and bloated body. And Tomakin, ex-director of hatcheries and conditioning, Tomakin was still on holiday from humiliation and pain, in a world where he could not hear those voices, that derisive laughter, could not see that hideous face, feel those moist and flabby arms around his neck, in a beautiful world. What you need, the savage went on, is something with tears for a change. Nothing costs enough here. $12.5 million, Henry Foster had protested when the savage told him that. $12.5 million, that's what the new conditioning center cost, not a cent less. Exposing what is mortal and unsure to all that fortune, death and danger dare, even for an eggshell. Isn't there something in that? He asked, looking up at Mustafa Mond. Quite apart from God, though of course God would be a reason for it. Isn't there something in living dangerously? There's a great deal in it, the controller replied. Men and women must have their adrenals stimulated from time to time. What? Questioned the savage, uncomprehendingly. It's one of the conditions of perfect health. That's why we've made the VPS treatments compulsory. VPS? Violent Passion Surrogate. Regularly once a month. We flood the whole system with adrenaline. It's the complete physiological equivalent of fear and rage. All the tonic effects of murdering Desdemona and being murdered by Othello without any of the inconveniences. But I like the inconveniences. We don't, said the controller. We prefer to do things comfortably. But I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin. In fact, said Mustafa Mond, you're claiming the right to be unhappy. All right then, said the savage defiantly. I'm claiming the right to be unhappy. Not to mention the right to grow old and ugly and impotent, the right to have syphilis and cancer, the right to have too little to eat, the right to be lousy, the right to live in constant apprehension of what may happen tomorrow, the right to catch typhoid, the right to be tortured by unspeakable pains of every kind. There was a long silence. I claim them all, the savage said at last. Mustafa Aman shrugged his shoulders. You're welcome, he said. Let me see how much I've read for a second. This is gonna take forever to upload. I think I'm gonna stop there because this is going to 40 minutes, but thanks for listening to Brave New World. And you know, I think reading books is legal if you provide commentary. So here's my commentary. I think it's obvious to some degree that both the Society, the World Controller, Mustafa Aman, and the Savage have their points. But I think, as I guess the book is supposed to persuade you, there's something more to the Savage's argument. Something that perhaps happiness isn't the ultimate good. That's called utilitarianism. I used to believe in that. Now I'm not so sure, because I know a lot of people, well, I don't know, I've heard before that the ultimate, end of, the ultimate, goal of society is for us to live, very similarly to this, but more extreme, for us to live in simulated realities. So we're just, I guess our bodies are just sitting there, and our brain is stimulated to believe in this virtual reality where everyone is happy, no one is sad. Well, that seems bad. It doesn't seem noble and grand and heroic, but everyone is happy. How can you argue with that? If everyone is happy, what are you missing? Art and beauty, but they don't want art and beauty. They're happy without it. Where there's art and beauty in the virtual reality, it's just not real. But I think that if I had the choice to live in that reality, even if I was completely confident that I would be happy for the rest of my life, I don't think I would do it. I think there's something to what the Savage is saying. I think danger can lead to happiness for one, but I think there's something besides happiness that matters. Bye guys.